Hi there, friends. Today I'm covering some of the most horrifying crocodile attacks ever. From a traveler who waded past every warning sign into an American crocodile's lagoon, to a man whose daily riverbank routine led him right to a waiting mugger crocodile. But first we start in the Northern Territory of Australia, where you'll witness the last minutes of fisherman Trent Kirkby. It was June 9th, 2019, and a still dry season morning had settled over a remote tidal river in the Northern Territory of Australia, the brown water sliding past long banks of soft mud and tangled mangrove. The air was already warming, the surface of the river dead calm and the color of weak tea, and a lone fisherman sat in a small aluminium dinghy anchored along a deep bend, casting for barramundi, with miles of empty country between him and the nearest other person. Trent Kirkby was a 46-year-old who had lived and fished in crocodile country his entire life and knew these rivers as well as anyone alive. He had seen big saltwater crocs 1,000 times, given them a wide berth, watched them slide off the banks and cruise past his boat, and slowly let that long run of nothing ever going wrong convince him he had the whole thing worked out. He fished these remote stretches alone all the time, comfortable in the way that only years without a single close call can make a person, and had stopped feeling the danger the way he had as a younger man. To him, the river had become a workplace rather than a threat. That morning, he had motored up to a bend he knew well and dropped anchor over a deep, quiet pool that sat hard against a steep, undercut mud bank. It was also exactly the kind of place a large territorial crocodile likes to hold. The deep water, the shadowed bank, the stillness, and Trent knew that as well as anyone and had simply stopped letting it change what he did. The fishing was good there, and that was the part of the morning he paid attention to. He had landed and released a couple good fish already, with no reason to think this morning was any different from the hundreds before it. He settled in to fish, casting and reeling in no particular hurry, the only sounds the lure hitting the water and the soft knock of the hull. Between casts he trailed a hand in the cool water to rinse the bait off his fingers and let a baited line hang over the low side of the dinghy, the gunnel sitting only a hand's width above the surface, the way he had 100 mornings before without a second thought. Everything about it was ordinary, and that was exactly the danger because the bend was not empty. A large male crocodile held that stretch of river as its own, and to it a small boat sitting still in the middle of that water may have been an intrusion to drive off, or simply something to investigate aggressively. Alone in a tin boat, with his hand in the water, in a bend a big crocodile owns. Routine for him maybe, but definitely a routine I would never keep. The saltwater crocodile is the largest living reptile, with large males able to exceed 18 feet in length, the most exceptional individuals surpassing 20 and weighing well over 1,000 pounds, and they are fiercely territorial in the water they claim. Large males have occasionally been documented ramming and biting small boats, particularly low aluminium dinghies that ride close to the surface, though they are usually reacting to what they read as a territorial intruder or to a sudden disturbance rather than deliberately hunting the boat itself. Whatever drives it, the result is the same, because a strike from an animal that size can pitch a person straight out of a small craft in a heartbeat, and the moment a human is in the water beside a big salty, the odds shift overwhelmingly in the crocodile's favor within seconds, and survival becomes extremely unlikely once it has a firm grip in deep water. A resident male may grow accustomed to the regular activity along its stretch of river, and a small dinghy sitting still over the deepest pool may trigger a territorial response or simply be something to investigate. Trent never saw it coming. The first thing he knew was a tremendous, jarring impact against the hull, the whole dinghy slamming sideways as the crocodile struck the stern, its jaws catching the outboard housing. The little craft pitched hard, water came over the side, and his footing went out from under him. Before he could grab the gunnel or anything to steady himself, he was over the side and into the brown river. In the water, his chances were almost none. The crocodile let go of the boat and turned to him at once, closing the small gap in an instant and seizing him, and then it took him under. Only after the grab and the drag came the rolling, the death roll a crocodile uses to overpower and drown, over and over in the deep water below the bank. The empty dinghy drifted in a slow circle above, its motor scarred and its anchor line still out, and within seconds the river had gone quiet again as if nothing had happened. A passing boat found the little craft later that day still riding at anchor, and the sight of it empty told its own story before anyone said a word. It rammed the boat and knocked him in before taking him. My own boat being hit out from under me is something that would just scare the lights out of me. When Trent didn't return that afternoon, his family raised the alarm, and rangers and police began working the river the next morning, running the deep bends and the banks in boats. Out there, the search is slow, grim work, and the river gives back what it wants to, when it wants to. They recovered his body over the following days, and the death was recorded as drowning and traumatic injury, consistent with a saltwater crocodile attack. Family and neighbors gathered at the boat ramp through those long days, waiting on news that nobody wanted to be the one to bring back. A large male was later located located holding that same stretch of river and was destroyed. The standard response in the territory once a crocodile has taken a person. People who knew Trent kept circling back to the same thought, that if anyone out there should have been safe, it was him, which is why the river got him. The bend he had trusted for years had never once stopped being what it always was. Australia was a man too at ease in his own backyard, undone by the one stretch of water he had quietly stopped respecting. Africa was the opposite kind of story, a man with no backyard to be careless in at all, only a lake he had to wade into before first light, whether he liked it or not. It was March 2nd, 2017, and a gray still dawn lay over the northern shore of Lake Victoria in Uganda. The vast lake, flat and silver, under a sky that had not quite woken up. A faint mist hung over the reedy shallows, the water barely moving, and out along the edge the fishing families were already awake and at work, because the work that feeds them starts long before the light does. Musa Uma was a 34-year-old fisherman who had set and hauled nets on this lake since he was a boy, the way his father had before him. He fished because his family ate what he caught and sold whatever was left over at the landing, and there was no version of his morning that did not begin with him standing in that water. He knew the lake held big crocodiles. Every fisherman did, and he had lost people he knew to them over the years. But knowing the danger and being able to do anything about it were two different things when the nets had to be worked and there was no other way to feed anyone. The lake was the only living he had ever known, and he had made his peace with its dangers the way a person makes peace with the weather. That morning he waded out thigh-deep through the shallows before sunrise to haul a gill net he had set the evening before, the cold water gripping his legs. Dawn is the worst possible time to be standing in that lake, and it is also the only time the nets can be worked, which is the cruel trap so many of these fishermen live their whole lives inside. He moved slowly along the net line, lifting it hand over hand, his back to the deeper water and his attention on the catch. He was out in that water before sunrise because fishing was the only way his family ate. It breaks my heart that he never really had a safer choice. The Nile crocodile kills more people than any other crocodile on Earth, with fatal attacks recorded across sub-Saharan Africa year after year. It is a patient ambush hunter that lies motionless at the edge of the shallows, often with only its eyes and nostrils above the surface, holding still and then exploding forward, only in the final instant. Dawn and dusk are when Nile crocodiles hunt most actively around the shorelines, and that is exactly when people come down to the water to fish and wash and fill their containers. A person standing quietly at the edge, busy with a task and facing the wrong way, is one of the situations Nile crocodiles most commonly exploit. A waiting fisherman, half bent over a net, presents exactly the low, distracted profile these crocodiles are built to rush, and the murk of the shallows hides the approach until the final, unstoppable second. The strike came without a sound. One moment he was lifting the net, and the next the crocodile surged from the shallow water beside him, a crushing force on his legs that took him off his feet before he could even cry out. The crocodile had him and was already powering backwards into deeper water, and there was no bracing against it and nothing to grab. Other fishermen out on the lake heard the sudden thrashing and the shouting and swung their boats toward it, paddling hard, but by the time they reached the place there was nothing on the surface but his half-hauled net drifting loose. No splash, no warning, just a surge and his legs gone from under him. I cannot get over how they give you absolutely nothing first. The search went on for days along that shoreline, the whole fishing community out in their boats and walking the banks, until his body was recovered some distance from where he had been working. Everyone knew which water it had happened in, but no one could say which crocodile had done it, and on a lake that size no one ever would. Local authorities recorded the death as a Nile crocodile attack, one more in a long and quiet line for those shores, and life on the lake went on the only way it could, because the same net still had to be hauled the very next morning. The landing lost one of its own that week, and still the boats pushed off into the dark before the next dawn, because hunger does not pause to mourn. Uganda was a man who had no choice at all but to be in that water. India was a man who had every choice in the world, and still made the same one every single day, at the same spot, where the crocodiles had simply learned that people came to the water there. It was October 11th, 2022, and a warm morning had settled over the city of Vadodara in western India, where a slow brown river called the Vishwamitri winds right through the middle of the streets and buildings. Traffic moved on the bridges, shops were opening, the ordinary noise of a city waking up filled the air, and the river slid through all of it. An ordinary urban river in almost every way, except for what lives in it. Mahesh Solanki was a 52-year-old man who had lived beside the Vishwamitri his whole life, and went down to the same stretch of stone steps most mornings. He had a fixed routine, the same steps, the same early hour, a wash and a few quiet minutes by the water before the day truly began, the kind of habit a person never once thinks twice about. Everyone in the city knew the river held crocodiles. They regularly turned up in streets and gardens after the monsoon, and the newspapers carried the sightings. But to Mahesh, the river had been part of home for 50 years, and familiarity has a way of quietly burying fear. The water was low and slow that morning, the far bank lined with the backs of buildings, the scene as familiar to him as his own front front room. What he never thought about was that a routine works in both directions. A crocodile that lives along the same stretch of river comes to associate the same steps with the people who appear there at the same hours, day after day. And a predator does not need to recognize any one person to begin associating that location with prey. That morning, he came down to the water as he always did, set his things on the step above the waterline, and crouched at the edge to wash. The river quiet and brown and unremarkable in front of him. The scariest part to me is that going to the same spot every morning is exactly what set him up. The croc didn't know him. It just learned that a meal turns up on those steps. The mugger crocodile is the third deadliest crocodile species to humans, behind only the Nile and the saltwater, and is responsible for dozens of fatal attacks across India in many years. It thrives in exactly these places, the urban rivers and reservoirs and irrigation canals threaded right through dense human population, and it is known to learn predictable routines and to return to the spots where people reliably enter the water. It does not stalk a particular person the way a film would show it, with intent and recognition. It simply waits, low and almost completely submerged, at a place that experience has taught it prey will appear. And the worn steps of a riverside gat, used at the same hours every day, are precisely such a place. Wildlife workers in cities like this are called out again and again to the same banks, and the animals keep returning because the river runs straight through the heart of where the people are. As Mahesh leaned out over the water to wash, the strike came from just off the submerged edge of the steps, where the stone dropped away into the murk. There was a violent surge, a grip on his arm and shoulder, and a pull toward the river so sudden and so strong that he was off the steps and into the water before anyone nearby had fully understood what they were seeing. People along the bank shouted and rushed toward the edge, but the crocodile had already dragged him out and down into the brown river, and there was nothing within reach for their grabbing hands to catch. He leaned down to wash like any other morning, and the river took him off the steps. I can't shake how ordinary a day it all seemed just seconds before. His body was recovered from the river later that same day, and the death was recorded as a mugger crocodile attack. In a city where people and crocodiles live this tangled up together, the response is rarely to kill the animal, because there is no shortage of them, and the river is theirs as much as anyone's. Forest Department officers set traps along that stretch in the days that followed, and a large mugger was eventually caught and relocated away from the populated banks. A protected species moved rather than destroyed. Officials repeated the warning the city has heard for years, that the river is not a safe place to wash or bathe, no matter how routine and harmless it feels. Neighbors who had seen him on those steps for years struggled to take in that the quiet morning ritual they all knew had been the very thing that killed him. India was a death hiding inside an ordinary daily habit. Mexico was a death that walked straight past a whole row of signs spelling the danger out in plain language, all for a quick evening swim at the worst possible hour of the day. It was July 19, 2016, and a warm, heavy dusk was settling over a coastal lagoon on the Pacific side of Mexico, just behind a popular stretch of resort beach. The day trippers had mostly packed up and gone. The sky was going from gold to gray. The cicadas were loud in the trees along the shore, and the calm brown water of the lagoon looked to exactly the wrong kind of person, like an inviting place for one more swim before dinner. Jasper Hartley was a 27-year-old traveler making his way along the coast, a few drinks into a warm evening with a group of friends. He was having the trip of his life and had reached that loose, invincible stage of a long holiday where the rules and warnings other people fuss over start to feel like they were written for somebody more careful than you. The lagoon sat just past the beach bar, flat and still and tempting in the last of the light, and somewhere in the easy mood of the evening, he decided that a swim was exactly what the moment called for. He was the kind of traveler who collected stories, always first in and last out, and that fearlessness had carried him a long way without real consequence. The trouble was that the lagoon was clearly marked. There were crocodile warning signs posted right along that water, the kind with a stark black silhouette and writing in 2 languages, and the local people, who knew exactly what lived in there, simply did not swim in that lagoon, least of all at dusk. His friends hesitated and half joked that maybe he should not, but Jasper laughed it off, stepped past the signs in the gathering dark, and waded out into the warm, waist-deep water with the easy confidence of someone nothing bad had ever happened to, walking right past the crocodile warning signs at dusk after a few drinks, to swim where the locals never would. Personally, I'd need a much better reason than a nice evening. The American crocodile is responsible for most of the fatal crocodile attacks reported in Mexico, and the lagoons and estuaries tucked just behind tourist beaches are some of the worst places for an encounter. They are large, powerful, capable predators, and like all crocodiles, they feed most actively at dusk and on into the night, sliding into the warm shallows under the cover of low light. The warning signs along water like this are not decoration and not local superstition. They are there because people have genuinely been taken from these exact spots. And a swimmer wading out into the shallows at dusk is doing the precise thing every single one of those signs is begging them not to do. Resort towns post them precisely because the lagoons behind their beaches are known crocodile habitat, and the visitors who never learn to read that danger are exactly the ones who end up testing it. Jasper was waist deep when the water around him erupted. The crocodile took him from below, and the sheer power of it was beyond anything a person could brace for, biting into him with tremendous force and pulling him beneath the surface before he could orient himself. His friends on the bank screamed his name, and two of them charged into the shallows after him, grabbing blindly at him in the churning, muddy water. Somehow, in the chaos and the thrashing, the crocodile released its grip, and they managed to haul him back toward the bank and out on the mud. But getting him out of the water was not the same as saving him. The injuries were already catastrophic, and he had likely inhaled water during the struggle, the kind of damage that doesn't wait and does not undo itself. He was barely conscious as they carried him up the bank, his friends shouting for help that was a long way off. The warm evening that had felt so harmless an hour ago now coming apart around them. His mates actually pulled him back off the croc, and even that wasn't enough. It honestly leaves me speechless that getting him out of the water still wasn't anywhere near enough to save him. They rushed him from the beach towards the nearest clinic, and from there on toward a proper hospital. But the catastrophic injuries he had suffered were far more than he could come back from. He had made it off the sand alive, which somehow only made the hours that followed harder for everyone who was with him. Jasper died at the hospital later that night. His friends were left to make the calls no one ever expects to make on a holiday, trying to find the words for how a swim at sunset had ended this way. The authorities afterward noted exactly what the signs along that lagoon had been saying all along, that the water was crocodile habitat and not a place for anyone to swim, least of all in the dark. Mexico was a warning written down plainly and ignored anyway. Back in Africa, the next man had no sign to read and no real choice to make, just a wide river standing between him and home, and the same shallow crossing his people had always used. It was September 14th, 2020, and the late afternoon sun hung low and hot over a wide, slow stretch of the Zambezi River in western Zambia. The great river braided into shallow channels running between long, pale sandbars. It is beautiful, open country, the water glinting in the low light and birds working the shallows, and it holds some of the largest Nile crocodiles anywhere in Africa. Muyamunalula was a 41-year-old man who lived on the far side of the river from the fields in the market, and he crossed the shallow channels on foot the way the people there always had. There was no bridge for many miles in either direction and no boat waiting that afternoon, so a wade across the shallows was simply how a person got home, the same as it had been for his parents and their parents before them. He had made the crossing more times than he could count, and had long since stopped thinking of it as anything but the walk home. That afternoon he stepped into a shallow channel to wade across, the warm water rising never much above his knees, the far bank and the path home in plain sight ahead of him. A crocodile doesn't need deep water to take a grown person. It needs only enough to hide its body and a place where it knows people will come, and a regular crossing is exactly such a place. He was partway over, moving steadily through the current with the water tugging at his legs, when the channel ahead of him gave no warning at all, a crossing he'd made 1,000 times, knee-deep with no bridge for miles. I can't imagine having to gamble on that water just to get home. Nile crocodiles in the Zambezi grow very large, and they are absolute masters of the ambush in exactly this kind of shallow, broken water. A crossing point is a gift to them because people enter the river at the same predictable places, and a big crocodile will lie still and patient in a channel and wait for the movement it has come to expect there. Shallow water offers no protection whatsoever, since the animal needs only enough depth to conceal its body and approach unseen. A person on foot in the middle of a channel has nowhere to run, nothing to hold on to, and no time to react once the strike comes out of water that looked, a second earlier, completely empty. The people who live along the Zambezi know which crossings have taken someone before, and they use them anyway, because the geography of their lives leaves them no alternative. It took him in the middle of the channel. There was a sudden explosion of water and a crushing grip on his leg, and in an instant, he was off his feet and being dragged toward the deeper water of the main river. He fought and shouted, thrashing against a strength there was simply no resisting, and people on both banks saw the whole thing happen and could do nothing but watch, helpless, as the crocodile pulled him from the shallows. Within moments, the surface had closed over the spot, and the channel ran quiet and smooth again, as though nothing had ever crossed it. One of the people on the bank was a boy who would describe it for years afterward, the speed of the thing and the terrible stillness that came right behind it. Knee-deep water was all it took, and he was pulled under while others watched, helpless. The fact that shallow water means nothing to these animals genuinely scares me. The search stretched along the banks and the sandbars for days, the village out in numbers looking, but the Zambezi is vast and runs fast and deep in its main channels, and his body was never recovered. For his family, there was not even the small mercy of something to bury, only the certainty of what the river had done, and the empty place where he should have been. The death was recorded as a Nile crocodile attack at a known crossing point. Without a body, there could be no proper burial, and his family was left with the particular open-ended grief itself, the river hands to so many along its banks. And the people there went on using that same ford in the days and weeks afterward, because the fields and the market were still on the far side, and the river was still the only way to reach them. Zambia was a man with no bridge and no choice but to trust the water one more time. Sri Lanka was a woman doing the most ordinary chore there is, at a spot the whole village used every day, in water everyone knew to fear and used anyway because there was no other water to use. It was January 23rd, 2023, and a hard midday sun beat down on a rural village in the dry zone of Sri Lanka, where the land depends on great ancient man-made reservoirs called tanks for nearly all of its water. The tank near the village had been there for centuries, its earthen bund and stone steps worn smooth by generations, and so in its own quiet way had the danger that lived in it. Dilrukshi Tenakun was a 33-year-old woman who lived in the village and came down to the tank most days to wash the family's clothes, exactly as the women there had always done. The steps leading into the water were where everyone gathered to wash and to bathe and to fill their pots, a place of ordinary daily life and quiet conversation that happened to sit at the edge of Crocodile water. She knew perfectly well the tank held muggers. Everyone in the village did, and like everyone she went down to it anyway, because the washing still had to be done and the tank was simply where you did it. She had children at home and a household to run, and the walk down to the water was just one more ordinary thread in the fabric of her day. That afternoon, she crouched on the lower steps with her bundle of washing, leaning out toward the water to wet and rinse the clothes the way she had 1,000 times before. The whole village used these same steps, and that very predictability is part of what makes them dangerous, because a crocodile sharing the tank comes to expect people right there, low at the edge, every single day. The brown water in front of her sat flat and still in the midday heat and gave no hint at all of what was lying just beneath it. She was just washing clothes at the same steps the whole village uses, in a tank everyone knows holds crocs. The fact there was nothing reckless about it is just heartbreaking to me. In the dry zone of Sri Lanka, many of these larger tanks support resident populations of mugger crocodiles, and washing and bathing right at the water's edge is among the most common circumstances in which people there are killed by them. A mugger may lie just off the submerged edge of the steps, completely hidden in the murky water, holding still in a spot where it has learned that people lean close to the water day after day. The victims are almost always doing something utterly routine and unremarkable, washing clothes, bathing a child, filling a pot, and that ordinariness is exactly what makes these attacks so common and so terribly hard to prevent. Researchers and wildlife officers have built fences and safe enclosures at some of the worst tanks, but they cannot fence every step on every reservoir, and so the attacks go on wherever people and crocodiles must share the same shrinking water. As Dilrukshi leaned out to rinse a piece of washing, the mugger lunged from the shallow edge right below her. It caught her in a single heartbeat and pulled her off the steps and into the tank. The strike so fast and so silent that the other women there barely had time to scream. They rushed to the edge and grabbed for her, hands out over the water, but the crocodile had already taken her down into the deeper, browner water of the tank, and the surface closed over the place where she had been kneeling only a second before. It had happened in the space of a single breath. In water they had all been standing in minutes earlier without a second thought. One leaned down to rinse a shirt, and she was gone in a second. I keep thinking about how there was no warning and no time at all to even change anything. The village searched the tank through the rest of the day, and her body was recovered before nightfall. In a place where the very same water gives life and takes it away, grief and routine end up living side by side in a way that is genuinely hard for outsiders to understand. Wildlife officers came out and warned the village, as they have so many times before, but no single crocodile could be picked out and blamed from among the many that shared the tank. The death was recorded as a mugger crocodile attack, and the next morning, because there was simply no other water, those same steps were back in use. Sri Lanka was an everyday chore. The water quietly turned fatal. The last one comes from Indonesia, the country with more reported crocodile attacks than any other on Earth, where the water itself runs so thick and dark that the ambush is already won long before the victim ever knows it has begun. It was November 5th, 2021, and the last light of the day was draining out of a mangrove coast on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. The tide run low, and the channels between the roots reduced to thick brown mud and shallow, soupy water. It is a dense maze of arching roots and standing murk, the kind of place where the line between land and water disappears, and it belongs completely to the saltwater crocodile. Andy Saharudin was a 36-year-old villager who fished and gathered along the mangroves at low tide, working the channels for fish and shellfish to feed and support his family. This was his livelihood and his daily routine, picking his way through the roots in the failing light, exactly the way the men of his village had always done it. He knew the mangroves held crocodiles, everyone on that coast did, and the village had lost people to them before. He had a wife and young children waiting in the village, and every low tide he spent out in the channels was a small wager he had made and won many times over. But the catch was was out in the channels. And the channels were where a man who needed to feed his family had to be, whatever was in the water with him. That evening, he waited along the mangrove edge as the light went, the water low and murky around his shins, the tangled roots crowding in close on every side. In water that thick and dark, there is simply no seeing anything below the surface. No warning shape, no shadow, no telltale ripple, nothing at all until it is already happening to you. He worked his way slowly along a channel he knew well, head down and focused on the catch, while the flat brown water around him gave back nothing. The tide would turn before long, and he meant to be done and back on solid ground by the time it did, the way he always was. Wading thick mangrove water at last light, blind to anything below, in the worst croc country on Earth. I would not last a minute, but this was his work. Indonesia records more reported crocodile attacks than any other country on Earth, and along these mangrove coasts, the saltwater crocodile is the animal behind them. The tangled roots and the muddy, low-visibility water make the mangroves a perfect ambush, hiding an animal that can pass 5 meters in length from view until the very instant it strikes. A person wading those channels at dusk, when the crocodiles move into the shallows to hunt and the light is failing, has no way at all to see what is in the water with them. And that total absence of any warning is exactly what makes these mangrove coasts the deadliest crocodile country on the planet. On some Indonesian coasts, the human toll runs into the hundreds, and still the fishing and the gathering never stop because the mangroves are the larder and the income for villages that have no other one. The crocodile came out of the murk without a sound. There was no shape and no ripple, only a sudden, enormous force that seized him at the legs and pulled him clean off his feet into the channel. He had almost no chance to see it, to brace or to fight, and it dragged him from the shallows down into the deeper water among the roots, almost before the splash he made had even settled. The mangroves that had given his village its living for generations closed over him in the last gray light of the day. It came out of water he couldn't even see into, with zero warning, attacked him, and was just instantly gone. This is exactly why Indonesia leads the world in these types of attacks, and it honestly terrifies me. When Andy didn't come back to the village that night, the men went out to search the channels by torchlight, calling and waiting, and his body was found the next day. Along these coasts, the loss of a fisherman to the water is a grief the whole village has felt before and knows, with a terrible certainty, it will feel again. In the days that followed, villagers and local officials hunted the animal, and a large saltwater male was eventually captured. The death was recorded as a saltwater crocodile attack, one more for one of the world's most dangerous crocodile coastlines on a shoreline where the water has always fed the living and taken some of them too. If these 7 taught me one thing, it is that a crocodile does not care whether you were careless or whether you simply had no other choice, because the water treats every one of them exactly the same. So tell me which one you would never have believed, and I'll see you next time.